The emergency alarm screamed through the Galactic Council chambers like a dying animal. Ambassador Zathera, her crystalline body catching the harsh red light, trembled so violently that pieces of her translucent skin began to crack and fall to the floor like broken glass. Her voice, usually melodic and calm, now carried the desperate edge of pure terror. "Honorable members of the Council," she began, her words distorting through the universal translator as her fear made her native harmonics unstable. "We have received the most horrific transmission from the Kepler Mining Consortium. The situation is esti. Struggling to find words that could properly convey the nightmare unfolding in space. The situation is beyond our worst fears." The massive holographic display at the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing grainy footage that made even the most hardened council members recoil in horror. The mining colony on Kepler 4b, once a peaceful operation extracting rare minerals from the planet's crust, had become a hellscape. Families who had volunteered for the dangerous but lucrative mining work were now trapped in makeshift cages, their screams echoing through the transmission. The pirates weren't just stealing resources, they were collecting people like trophies, broadcasting their suffering across subspace frequencies for entertainment. Children cried for parents who couldn't reach them. Workers who had spent years building the colony now watched helplessly as everything they had created was destroyed for sport. Council leader Vexenol, his tentacles curling and uncurling in the nervous pattern his species displayed during extreme stress, leaned forward in his biomechanical chair. His 3 eyes blinked in sequence, a sure sign he was processing information at maximum capacity. "Surely the humans will respond with their standard relief package," he asked, though his voice carried a note of desperate hope rather than confidence. "Medical supplies, food rations, diplomatic negotiators, perhaps a small peacekeeping force?" The other council members nodded in agreement, their various alien forms bobbing and swaying in the universal gesture of consensus. Everyone knew Earth's reputation throughout the galaxy. The humans were the soft-hearted ones, the species that insisted on talking first and fighting only as a last resort. They were famous for their humanitarian aid convoys, their medical ships, their endless patience with diplomatic solutions. When the Zephyrian trade dispute had erupted 3 cycles ago, the humans had sent economists and mediators. When the crystalline plague had swept through the outer rim, Earth had dispatched hospital ships and research teams. When the orbital city of New Horizon had suffered catastrophic life support failure, human engineers had worked around the clock to save every single inhabitant. This was who the humans were. This was what they did. They healed, they helped, they talked until everyone found a solution that worked for everybody. Meanwhile, millions of miles away on Earth, Admiral Giwoo Kim sat in the Strategic Command Center deep beneath the Korean Peninsula. The underground facility hummed with quiet efficiency, its walls lined with holographic displays showing military assets across human space. Kim was small for a military commander, barely reaching 5 feet in height, but her presence filled the room like a gathering storm. Her black coffee had gone cold hours ago as she reviewed the intercepted pirate transmissions. The ceramic mug sat forgotten on her desk while she watched footage that made her jaw clench so tightly her teeth hurt. These weren't random raiders looking for quick profit. These were sadists who had turned human suffering into entertainment. The mining colony had been home to 12,000 people, families who had signed 5-year contracts to work the dangerous mineral extraction operations. Engineers who had built the colony from nothing but raw materials and determination. Teachers who had established schools for the children. Doctors who had set up medical facilities to serve the community. Now those same doctors were being forced to treat injuries that the pirates had deliberately inflicted, only to watch their patients be hurt again for the cameras. The teachers were locked in the same cages as their students, unable to protect the children they had sworn to educate and nurture. Lieutenant Dayon Park, Kim's aide-de-camp, nervously cleared his throat. He was young for his rank, having earned his position through exceptional performance in the military academy rather than years of service. His hands shook slightly as he held the datapad containing the Council's official request for assistance. He said, his voice carefully controlled, but unable to hide his underlying anxiety. The Galactic Council has sent their formal request for humanitarian assistance. They're expecting our standard relief response within 72 hours. Medical supplies, food aid, diplomatic negotiators, and perhaps a small peacekeeping force. Of no more than... Admiral Kim's smile cut through his words like a blade through silk. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that had made her legendary among human military circles. The kind that appeared just before she solved problems in ways that left her enemies wishing they had never been born. "Oh, we'll send relief all right," she said, her voice carrying the deceptive calm of deep water just before a tsunami. She spun her chair to face the room's central AI terminal, a sophisticated system that glowed with soft blue light. "Ares, I need a tactical assessment. How many of our heavy battleships can reach the Kepler system within 48 hours? The AI's response came immediately, its voice synthesized to sound reassuringly. Human but carrying undertones of computational power that no biological mind could match. 17 Dreadnought-class battleships are currently within range, Admiral. This carries a full complement of Marines, plus supporting destroyer and cruiser escorts. Total force projection capability would be approximately. Detail for now?" Kim interrupted, her smile growing wider and somehow more terrifying. 17 ships should be sufficient to handle this particular relief operation. Lieutenant Park's face went pale as he realized what his commander was planning. "Admiral, with respect, the Council is expecting a humanitarian convoy, not a battle fleet. If we arrive with 17 battleships... Kim stood up from her chair, her small frame somehow managing to dominate the entire room through sheer force of personality. "Lieutenant, those pirates have been broadcasting their atrocities for weeks. They've turned human suffering into an entertainment program. They've made children watch their parents die. They've made parents watch their children suffer." Her voice dropped to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "They want to show the galaxy what happens when you prey on the innocent." She walked to the tactical display, her fingers dancing across the holographic controls to show the disposition of human forces throughout the sector. Red dots marked the locations of military assets, each one representing firepower that could level entire cities. "It's time we showed them what happens when you prey on our innocent," she continued, her voice still soft but filled with the promise of absolute destruction. "Ares, prepare Operation Righteous Fury. Full stealth approach, maximum force authorization. No survivors protocol?" The AI acknowledged the order with a simple chime, but Lieutenant Park felt his blood freeze. He had heard whispers of Operation Righteous Fury in the Academy, rumors of a classified military doctrine that was only activated when diplomacy was no longer an option. When humans decided that talking was over, and it was time to remind the galaxy why Earth's military existed. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the other species see us as peacekeepers. They think we're soft. If we respond with overwhelming military force..." Admiral Kim turned back to him, and for a moment Lieutenant Park saw something in her eyes that made him understand why the pirates were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. "Good," she said simply. "Let them keep thinking that, right? Up until the moment our guns start firing." Warlord Krexstar stretched his massive arms above his head and let out a satisfied growl that echoed through the stolen mining facility's control room. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, his reptilian body was covered in thick, scarred hide that told the story of a lifetime spent in violent conquest. Well, his yellow eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction as he surveyed the chaos he had created below. A mining colony that had once been a peaceful home to 12,000 people was now his personal entertainment center. What had taken years to build, he had transformed into a nightmare in just 3 weeks. The main plaza, where families used to gather for community events, now housed rows of metal cages. The school building had been converted into his personal torture chamber. The medical center was being used to keep his victims alive just long enough to suffer more. Krexstar loved the power. He loved watching strong humans break down into sobbing messes. He especially enjoyed the moment when parents realized they couldn't protect their children anymore. The look of absolute despair in their eyes was better than any drug he had ever tried. His crew of cutthroats, gathered from the worst criminals across a dozen different worlds, shared his twisted sense of entertainment. They competed with each other to see who could cause the most creative suffering. They broadcast their atrocities across subspace frequencies, turning human pain into a sick form of reality television that other pirate groups watched for entertainment. The communication console on the bridge chirped with an incoming signal. Krekstar's communications officer, a thin creature with multiple arms and cybernetic implants covering half his face, turned from his station with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Boss," the officer said, his voice distorted by the mechanical voice box that replaced his natural vocal cords. "Long-range sensors are picking up incoming vessels. Looks like the cavalry is finally arriving." He paused to check his readings again, then let out a harsh, mechanical laugh. "Oh, this is rich. It's just the humans." 17 ships moving at standard relief convoy speed. The bridge erupted in laughter. Pirates from 6 different species howled, roared, and made whatever noise their vocal systems produced when they found something hilarious. The idea that humans would try to rescue their people was funnier than any joke they had ever heard. Krekstar's grin revealed rows of serrated teeth that he had sharpened to point specifically to intimidate his victims. Each tooth was stained with old blood, and several had small notches carved into them to mark particularly satisfying kills. "Excellent," he roared, his voice carrying the kind of joy that children might show when opening birthday presents. "More toys to play with? Tell me, how many ships did you say?" 17 vessels, sir, all moving at the slow, cautious speed that humans use for their precious humanitarian missions." The communications officer pulled up a tactical display that showed the approaching fleet as small, harmless-looking dots on the screen. Based on their approach, vector, and speed, they should arrive in approximately 6 hours. Krekstar clapped his massive hands together, producing a sound like thunder. 17 ships full of soft, crying humans who think they can negotiate with us. His laughter was so loud that it could be heard throughout the facility, causing the prisoners below to look up with a mixture of hope and terror. "This is going to be the best entertainment we've had since we arrived," he turned to his tactical officer, a hulking brute whose species communicated primarily through grunts and gestures. "Send a message to all the other pirate fleets in this sector. Tell them to get here as fast as they can. They won't want to miss this show." His eyes gleamed with anticipation. "We're going to make these soft-hearted humans beg for mercy. Then we're going to make them watch while we hurt their precious colonists. And finally, we're going to broadcast. Their final moments live to Earth so everyone can see what happens when you send peacekeepers to fight real warriors." The tactical officer grunted his understanding and began transmitting messages to pirate groups throughout the region. Within minutes, confirmations started coming back. Ships full of bloodthirsty criminals began changing course toward Kepler-4 for to be eager to witness what promised to be the most entertaining massacre in recent memory. Meanwhile, 3 levels below, the control room in what used to be the colony's emergency shelter, Dr. Yunji Park pressed her ear against the cold metal wall. The shelter had been converted into a makeshift prison, packed with colonists who were being kept alive only because Krekstar enjoyed having a steady supply of victims. EUNG was small and looked fragile, but her appearance was deceiving. Before becoming the colony's chief medical officer, she had served 8 years as a combat medic with the Earth's Marines. She had patched up soldiers under enemy fire, performed surgery in bombed-out buildings, and seen more violence than most people could imagine. The pirates had beaten her repeatedly, but they hadn't broken her spirit. She had been carefully listening to the pirates' communications whenever possible, using her knowledge of military protocols to piece together information about their operations. Her medical training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, and her military experience had taught her to always look for opportunities. What she heard through the wall made her smile for the first time since the pirates had arrived. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of expression that appeared on the face of someone who knew a terrible secret that their enemies didn't. Colony. Administrator Minho Lee lay on the floor nearby, his face a map of purple and yellow bruises. That told the story of 3 weeks of systematic abuse. He had been the colony's leader, responsible for the welfare of 12,000 people. The weight of his failure to protect them had been crushing him more than any physical torture the pirates could devise. What is it, Doc? He whispered, barely able to speak through his swollen lips. Did you hear something? Youngji turned away from the wall, and Minho was surprised to see that her eyes were bright with something that looked almost like anticipation. Help's coming, she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that seemed completely out of place in their current situation. The pirates said it's just a relief convoy, Minho replied, his voice heavy with despair. 17. Ships full of medical supplies and negotiators. How is that going to help us? These monsters aren't going to be impressed by humanitarian aid. Yoonji's smile grew wider, and for a moment she looked less like a beaten prisoner and more like the combat veteran she had once been. Minho, those idiots upstairs have made the biggest mistake of their miserable lives. What do you mean? They think they know what humans are like. They think we're soft because we prefer diplomacy to violence. They think we're weak because we try to save lives instead of taking them. She leaned closer to him, lowering her voice to barely a whisper. But they've never seen what happens when humans decide that talking time is over. Minho looked confused, but it's just a relief convoy. Medical ships and negotiators, right? Yoonji shook her head slowly. No, Minho. When humans say they're sending relief, it doesn't always mean what other species think it means. Sometimes it means relief for the victims by permanently removing the problem. Her eyes hardened with memories of battles fought in distant systems. Those pirates just invited the Earth military to their party, and they have no idea what they've done. Around them, other prisoners began to take notice of their conversation. Word spread quietly through the shelter that Dr. Park seemed to know something the rest of them didn't. For the first time in weeks, a few people dared to hope that their nightmare might finally be coming to an end. But none of them, not even Yoonji with all her military experience, could have imagined what was actually heading their way through. The darkness of space. The first sign that something was wrong came as a ripple in hyperspace itself. The distortion appeared on every sensor screen in the Kepler system simultaneously. A massive wave of energy that announced the arrival of something far larger than anyone had expected. Space itself seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then reality tore open like fabric being ripped apart. 17 ships materialized out of the swirling vortex of hyperspace in a formation so precise it looked like a deadly dance choreographed by death itself. They didn't stumble out of hyperspace the way most ships did, struggling to regain their bearings after the disorienting journey between stars. Instead, they emerged with the fluid grace of apex predators who had done this 1,000 times before. Every pirate vessel in the system immediately went silent. Communication channels that had been filled with crude jokes and boasting suddenly carried nothing but the sound of terrified breathing. Sensor operators across the pirate fleet stared at their screens in disbelief, running diagnostics again and again because the readings they were getting simply couldn't be real. These weren't the small, unarmed medical ships that everyone had expected. These weren't the converted cargo vessels that typically carried humanitarian supplies. These were warships, and not just any warships. These were the kind of vessels that existed in the nightmares of military strategists throughout the galaxy. Each ship stretched over 1 kilometer in length, their hulls painted in the deep black of space itself, so that they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it.
Oh.
Their surfaces bristled with weapon systems that most pirate vessels couldn't even identify. Massive railguns that could punch holes through asteroids, energy weapons that could boil away the atmosphere of a small moon, missile tubes that could launch enough firepower to level entire cities. The lead ship was particularly terrifying. Where other vessels might have names painted on their hulls or decorative markings that showed their origin, this one bore only a simple designation: TDF, Retribution. The name was written in letters that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. Below it was a symbol that made experienced pirates throughout the system feel ice water flowing through their veins. It was the symbol of the Terran Defense Force. Earth's military arm that most species preferred to pretend didn't exist. Everyone knew that humans had a military, of course, but the galaxy had convinced itself that it was a small, peaceful organization focused on defense and rescue operations. The reality hanging in space before them told a very different story. Admiral Gi-woo Kim's face suddenly appeared on every screen in the system. From the smallest pirate scout ship to the mining colony's emergency broadcasts, the signal override was so complete and effortless that it was clear the human fleet had taken control of all communications without anyone even noticing. Her image was crystal clear, transmitted in perfect detail that somehow made her presence feel immediate and personal. She was smaller than most people expected from a military commander, but her presence filled every screen with an authority that made hardened criminals instinctively step back from their monitors. Her uniform was crisp and perfectly pressed, her posture ramrod straight, and her expression carried the kind of calm that only came from absolute confidence in one's ability to destroy everything in sight. "This is Admiral Gi-woo Kim of the Terran Defense Force," she began, her voice carrying across space with perfect clarity. There was no anger in her tone, no shouting or threats. She spoke with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone announcing the weather. "To the civilians currently being held on Kepler 4 for DB, we are here. Your suffering ends today." She paused for a moment, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The change was subtle, but every person watching felt their blood pressure spike as they realized they were looking at a predator who had just identified her prey. "To the pirates currently occupying that world," she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you have exactly one opportunity to surrender. You will release all hostages immediately, disable your weapons, and prepare to be taken into custody. You have 60 seconds to comply." On the bridge of the pirate flagship, Warlord Krekstar felt his world collapsing around him. His communications officer was frantically checking and rechecking his sensor readings, his multiple arms moving in a blur as he tried to make sense of data that seemed impossible. "Sir," the officer stammered, his mechanical voice box struggling to process the fear in his biological vocal cords. "Their lead ship. According to our sensors, it has more firepower than our entire combined fleet. And there are 16 more vessels just like it." Krekstar's usual confidence was evaporating like water in a desert. His yellow eyes darted between the tactical display and the image of Admiral Kim on his main screen. "Impossible," he snarled, but his voice cracked like an adolescent going through puberty. "Humans are weak. Everyone knows they're peacekeepers. They send medical supplies and negotiators." But even as he spoke the words, he could see the truth hanging in space before him. These weren't the ships of a peaceful species. These were the tools of a military force that had been designed for one purpose: to destroy anything that threatened Earth's citizens. Throughout the pirate fleet, similar scenes were playing out. Captains who had spent their careers raiding helpless merchant vessels were suddenly faced with warships that made their own vessels look like children's toys. Pirates who had never encountered serious military opposition were staring at sensor readings that suggested each human ship could single-handedly destroy their entire fleet. Some of the smaller pirate vessels immediately began powering up their hyperspace drives, hoping to escape before the situation got any worse. Others started frantically transmitting surrender signals, suddenly realizing that their weeks of entertainment might have consequences they hadn't considered. On the bridge of the Retribution, her officers, all veterans of conflicts that the galaxy preferred to forget, waited for her orders with the patience of professionals who knew their business. "Ares," she said, addressing the ship's artificial intelligence, "what is our current status regarding the surrender deadline?" The AI's response came immediately, its synthesized voice carrying a note of cold satisfaction that seemed almost human in its emotional content. "Deadline expired 3.7 seconds ago, Admiral. Multiple pirate vessels are attempting to flee the system. No surrender signals have been received from the planetary surface." Admiral Kim's smile could have frozen plasma into solid matter. It was the kind of expression that made her crew feel privileged to serve under her command, and made her enemies wish they had chosen different career paths. "Tactical assessment, Ares. How long to neutralize all hostile forces in the system? Estimated time for complete target elimination. 4 minutes, 37 seconds, Admiral. Shall I begin target acquisition?" "Not yet." Kim turned to her human officers, her voice carrying the deadly calm of deep ocean water just before a tsunami. These creatures have spent the last 3 weeks torturing innocent people for entertainment. They've turned human suffering into a broadcast for other criminals to enjoy. They've made children watch their parents die, and parents watch their children suffer. She paused, looking out at the pirate fleet through the bridge's main view screen. They wanted to show the galaxy what happens when you prey on the innocent. I think it's time we showed them what happens when you prey on our innocent. The bridge fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the ship's systems. Every officer present understood what they were about to witness. This wasn't going to be a battle. This was going to be an extermination carried out with the precision and efficiency that had made the Terran defense. Force and name whispered in fear throughout the darker corners of the galaxy. No witnesses, Admiral Kim said quietly. No survivors, no mercy. The moment Admiral Kim gave the order, space around Kepler 44 to be transformed into something that would be studied in military academies for centuries to come. What happened next wasn't warfare in any traditional sense. It was a demonstration of what happened when a truly advanced military force decided to stop pretending to be peaceful. The first pirate vessel to die was a converted cargo hauler that had been modified with stolen weapons and painted with skull decorations. Its captain, a notorious criminal named Vexcar, who had spent 15 years raiding helpless colonies, had just enough time to register the 3 human destroyers approaching his position before his world ended. The destroyers moved like hunting wolves, their coordination so perfect it seemed choreographed. They didn't waste energy on dramatic maneuvers or intimidating displays. They simply positioned themselves at optimal firing angles and opened fire with weapons that turned the pirate ship into expanding gas and debris. In exactly 4.3 seconds, the second pirate vessel, a heavily armed cruiser that served as the flagship for a smaller raiding group, tried to fight back. Its captain had convinced himself that human ships were probably just modified civilian vessels with fancy paint jobs. He ordered his weapons officer to fire everything they had at the nearest human destroyer. The pirate ship's weapons were impressive by criminal standards. Plasma cannons that could melt through asteroid rock, missile launchers loaded with warheads designed to crack open space stations, energy beams that could slice through the hull of a merchant vessel like a knife through paper. All of this firepower struck the human destroyer's shields and simply disappeared. It was absorbed so completely that the human ship didn't even slow down. The return fire lasted less than 2 seconds. When the energy beams faded, there was nothing left of the pirate cruiser except glowing particles scattered across several cubic kilometers of space. But Admiral Kim wasn't interested in quick, clean deaths for all of her enemies. These particular pirates had earned something special. She studied the tactical display showing the remaining enemy vessels, her expression thoughtful as she planned their fates. "Ares," she said, her voice carrying the casual tone someone might use when ordering coffee. "I want you to disable the engines on the remaining ships, but leave their life support systems functional. Precision strikes only. I want them to sit in the dark and think about what they've done." The AI acknowledged her order with mechanical efficiency. "Understood, Admiral. Implementing selective targeting protocols. Estimated time to complete engine neutralization, 97 seconds. What followed was a masterclass in precision warfare. Human weapon systems, guided by artificial intelligence that could calculate trajectories and impact points with mathematical perfection, began surgically, removing the capability for flight from every pirate vessel in the system. Engine compartments were vaporized with pinpoint accuracy while the rest of each ship remained intact. Power systems were disabled with strikes so precise they left life support functioning while cutting off everything else. One by one, pirate ships went dark and dead in space, their crews trapped in metal coffins that still had air and heat, but no hope of escape. The pirates, who had spent weeks broadcasting the suffering of innocent people, were now floating helplessly in the void, waiting for whatever judgment the humans had planned for them. While the space battle concluded with terrifying efficiency, the real relief operation was beginning on the planet's surface. Human Marines, the legendary soldiers who had earned their reputation fighting in conditions that would kill most other species, prepared for what they called a humanitarian intervention. Colonel Hunawachoi stood in the drop bay of the assault, ship Thunder of Seoul, surrounded by 200 of the most elite soldiers in human space. These weren't ordinary troops. They were specialists trained for exactly this kind of operation: urban warfare against enemies who used civilians as shields. Choi was a compact man with scars on his hands that told the story of 20 years fighting in places the civilian population preferred not to think about. His armor was matte black. It's covered with sensors and communication equipment that connected him to every soldier under his command. More importantly, it connected him to the artificial intelligence systems that would coordinate their assault with mathematical precision. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying through the armor's communication system to reach every Marine in the unit. "The people down there have been living in hell for 3 weeks. They've watched their friends die. They've seen their children hurt. They've been used as entertainment by creatures who think human suffering is funny." He paused, checking his weapon one final time. The rifle in his hands was a work of art, engineered to be lethal at ranges that would make a sniper jealous while remaining compact enough for close-quarters combat. Every pirate who laid a hand on those civilians dies today. Every pirate who made a child cry dies today. Every pirate who thought human pain was entertaining is about to learn what real terror feels like. The drop bay doors opened, revealing the mining colony spread out below them. From this altitude, it looked almost peaceful, but Choi's enhanced vision could see the details that told the real story: improvised cages in the main plaza, bodies that hadn't been removed from the streets, scorch marks on buildings where the pirates had used weapons for entertainment rather than warfare. "Remember," Choi continued as his Marines checked their equipment one final time, "we're not just soldiers today. We're angels of vengeance for every innocent person who suffered while we were too far away to help. Make it count." The Marines began their descent in complete silence, their armor's stealth systems making them nearly invisible against the colony's background. They moved like ghosts, guided by AI systems that had already mapped every building, identified every pirate position, calculated the optimal approach routes to minimize civilian casualties while maximizing enemy elimination. On the ground, the pirates who had been left to guard the colony were starting to realize that something had gone terribly wrong. The triumphant communications from their fleet had suddenly gone silent. The promised entertainment of watching humans beg for mercy had been replaced by an ominous quiet that made even the most hardened criminals nervous. Jexra, a pirate lieutenant who had personally overseen the torture of dozens of colonists, was standing guard at the main prisoner compound when he noticed movement in the shadows between buildings. At first, he thought it might be an escaped prisoner trying to hide, but something about the way the shadows moved made his predatory instincts scream warnings. The last thing he saw was a brief muzzle flash from a weapon he never heard fire. The Marines had arrived, and they brought with them a justice that the pirates had never imagined possible. Dr. Yoonji Park, still trapped in the underground prison with the other survivors, heard the first signs of the rescue operation beginning. Above them, the sounds were subtle at first, footsteps that moved with purpose rather than the chaotic stomping of pirate boots. Voices that spoke in clipped professional tones rather than crude shouts and laughter. "That's not the pirates," she whispered to Administrator Minho Lee, her medical training helping her stay calm, while her military experience told her exactly what those sounds meant. "That's the sound of professionals at work." Above them, the human Marines began their systematic liberation of the colony, moving through the settlement like a force of nature that couldn't be stopped, negotiated with, or escaped. The pirates who had spent weeks terrorizing helpless civilians were about to discover what happened when they faced soldiers who had trained their entire lives for exactly this moment. The hunt had begun, and there would be no mercy for those who had shown none to the innocent. 12 hours after the first human Marines had touched down on Kepler 4, for to be, the mining colony looked like a completely different world. The metal cages that had held families captive were being dismantled by human engineers who worked with the same ruthless efficiency their military had displayed. The makeshift torture chambers had been converted back into community spaces. Bodies of pirates lay where they had fallen, serving as grim reminders of what happened when predators encountered apex predators. The transformation was remarkable not just for its speed, but for its completeness. Human medical ships had descended from orbit like angels of mercy, their holds filled with equipment that made the colony's original medical bay look primitive by comparison. Trauma surgeons who had learned their craft patching up soldiers in war zones worked, alongside engineers who could rebuild entire city blocks with nothing but raw materials and determination. Dr. Yunji Park found herself standing in what had been the colony's main medical facility just 3 days earlier, but she barely recognized it. The pirates had trashed the building, using medical equipment as torture devices and turning the surgery suites into interrogation rooms. Now it gleamed. With new equipment that had been installed so quickly, it seemed like magic. Advanced medical scanners hummed quietly as they assessed injuries that would have taken weeks to properly diagnose with the colony's original equipment. Robotic surgical assistants moved with precision that human hands couldn't match, repairing damage that would have left permanent scars with the old technology. Most incredibly, patients who had been on the edge of death from weeks of systematic abuse were already showing signs of recovery. Admiral Kim stood near the main diagnostic station, her presence somehow both commanding and comforting. She had removed her military jacket, revealing a simple uniform shirt that made her look less like a terrifying military commander and more like someone's concerned aunt. But Yunji could still see the steel in her eyes, the absolute certainty of someone who had just solved a problem that others had thought unsolvable. Admiral Yunji said, approaching with the careful respect of one professional addressing another. I have to ask you something that's been bothering me since this morning. How did you get here so fast? The distress call was only sent 3 days ago. Even at maximum hyperspace speed, it should have taken your fleet at least a week to reach us from Earth. Kim's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she looked genuinely sad, rather than militarily focused. Dr. Park, we've been tracking this particular group of pirates for the better part of 8 months. They've hit 17 colonies. Before yours, always following the same pattern. It's always targeting civilians, always taking their time to maximize suffering, always broadcasting their atrocities like it was some kind of entertainment program. She gestured toward a holographic display that showed the locations of previous attacks, each one marked with data about casualties and duration. They hit the Arcturus mining station 4 months ago, spent 2 weeks there before they got bored and moved on. Then the New Horizon agricultural complex. Then the Centauri research outpost. Every time, they left behind the same calling card. Families destroyed, communities shattered, and recordings of human suffering being broadcast to criminal networks throughout the galaxy. Yunji felt her blood run cold as she realized the implications. You mean this wasn't random? They were specifically targeting human settlements? Exactly, Kim's voice hardened again, taking on the edge that had made pirate captains across the sector realize they had made a fatal mistake. They thought humans were easy targets because we preferred diplomacy to violence. They thought our humanitarian reputation meant we were weak. They made the mistake of thinking that compassion equals vulnerability. She turned to look out the medical bay's windows, where human engineering teams were working to restore the colony's infrastructure. The moment we intercepted your distress call, Task Force Retribution was already en route. We had been positioning assets throughout this sector for weeks, waiting for them to make their move. Just let them think they were getting a standard relief convoy until it was too late for them to escape. Across the galaxy, the footage was spreading through communication networks like wildfire. But these weren't the torture videos that the pirates had been broadcasting for entertainment. Those transmissions had been cut short and very permanent. Ways their sources reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas and twisted metal. Instead, the galaxy was watching something that would change how every species viewed humanity for generations to come. Security cameras on trade stations and passenger ships recorded the same images over and over. 17 human battleships, emerging from hyperspace with the coordination of a military force that had perfected the art of warfare. Human Marines, moving through hostile territory with precision that made elite special forces from other species look like amateur enthusiasts. An entire pirate fleet, one that had terrorized peaceful settlements for months, simply ceasing to exist in the span of minutes. The Galactic Council's emergency session was very different from the panicked meeting that had occurred just days earlier. The vast chamber was filled with the same representatives who had gathered to discuss the mining colony crisis. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had been desperate fear, there was now thoughtful silence. Where there had been frantic calls for help, there was now careful consideration of what they had just witnessed. Ambassador Zathara's crystalline form barely trembled as she spoke to the assembly, her harmonic voice carrying none of the terror that had characterized her previous communications. "Honorable members of the council," she began, her words measured and deliberate. "Perhaps it is time we updated our files on human relief efforts." Council leader Vexenal S. Tentacles, which had been writhing with nervous energy during the previous meeting, were now completely still. His three eyes blinked in the slow, thoughtful pattern that his species used when processing complex information. "Indeed, Ambassador, it appears that when humans say they are sending aid, they mean something quite different from what the rest of us understand by that term." He paused, reviewing the footage that had been transmitted from the Kepler system. "They mean aid to the victims by permanently removing the source of the problem. They mean relief for the suffering by ensuring that those who cause suffering can never do so again." Throughout the chamber, representatives from dozens of species nodded in agreement. The Zephyrians, known for their analytical approach to military strategy, were already updating their assessments of human combat capabilities. The Crystalline Collective, whose people valued precision above all else, were impressed by the surgical accuracy of the human response. Even the warrior clans of Rigel, who had spent centuries believing that humans were too soft for real conflict, were quietly revising their opinions. Meanwhile, millions of light years away in Earth's strategic command, Admiral Jiwoo Kim sat in her office, reviewing intelligence reports that painted a disturbing picture. The pirates who had terrorized Kepler 442b hadn't been an isolated group. They were part of a larger network of criminal organizations that had been systematically targeting human settlements throughout the outer colonies. Her coffee was fresh this time, steam rising from the ceramic mug as she studied holographic displays, showing 17 other colonies that had gone silent in recent months. Each one followed the same pattern. Initial raids that seemed random, followed by systematic destruction of infrastructure. And finally, the complete disappearance of the entire population. Her aide, Lieutenant Dayon Park, stood nearby with a datapad containing preliminary analysis from the intelligence division. "Admiral," he said carefully, "our analysts believe that the Kepler operation was actually a test case. The pirates were trying to determine how humans would respond to direct attacks on civilian populations." Kim's smile was patient and cold, the expression of someone who had just realized that her enemies had provided her with the perfect opportunity to send a message that would be heard throughout the galaxy. "Lieutenant, please transmit a message to Fleet Command. Tell them that Operation Righteous Fury is now a permanent protocol. Any attack on human civilians anywhere in the galaxy will result in the complete and total elimination of those responsible." Stood up and walked to the window that looked out over Earth's capital city, where millions of people went about their daily lives, completely unaware of the violence that had been prevented by the actions of their military. The galaxy is full of predators who haven't yet learned what happens when they mistake human compassion for human weakness. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who looked deceptively small and peaceful, someone who could easily be mistaken for a civilian administrator or academic researcher, but her eyes held the promise of absolute destruction for anyone foolish enough to threaten the people she had sworn to protect. "The lesson plan is just getting started," she said quietly. "Already planning the next phase of humanity's education program for the galaxy's criminal element."